Several of Star Wars Unlimited's earliest sets have been a bit underpowered, causing the majority of decks to fall back on staples from the very first set. But Legends of the Force has managed to create some unique new archetypes, while also presenting interesting new inclusions for leaders from the first 4 sets. But everybody already has a pretty decent idea of which decks are going to end up at the very top of competitive play. So instead, today I want to talk about the level of power just below the top. These 3 decks represent, to me, a dark horse element in the meta. Decks that could win on any given day, but have glaring weaknesses or bad matchups that prevent them from ascending to that number 1 spot consistently. Even though they occupy a space on the fringe of viability, I don't think these decks should be mistaken as bad, since they are fully capable of doing some serious damage if things go their way. A great example of a deck that can really get out of control if you're not ready for it, and the first deck I want to talk about today, is Kylo Ren, Rash, and Deadly. Of course, this deck has been around for a while in some form or another, but Legends of the Force has had a surprising impact on this list, with about a quarter of the deck being cards from the new set. It's also arguable that several of the worst cards in this version of the list should be swapped out for some of the new lightsabers, which would bring that percentage even higher. Of course, the deck's core hit-face strategy hasn't changed at all, with a variety of high-attack, low-cost units, and some self-discard synergies to enable Kylo's aggressive stat line. But these new cards have made the deck faster as well as more resilient. Grand Inquisitor is an extremely aggressively statted turn 2 play that has synergy with Fifth Brother, a card that some lists have cut but I think has earned its spot. Quinlan Voss is another strong force unit that hits for an astounding 8 damage on base if you discard with Kylo, and that's before upgrades, making it an absurdly strong finisher. All 3 of these units are potential fallen lightsaber targets alongside Kylo himself, but the upgrade I've been winning the most games with is another new card, Battle Fury. This gives fallen lightsaber stats for 1 less resource at the cost of discarding a card on attack, a drawback that this deck is uniquely well situated to deal with. The discount is nice, but the bigger deal is the lack of a vehicle restriction on Battle Fury, which, unlike lightsabers, can be placed onto ships. While most versions of this Kylo deck have always had some sort of space presence, Battle Fury turns cards like Von Reg's TIE Interceptor, Kylo's TIE Silencer, and the brand new Strike Ship into game-warping threats, especially given the number of Force decks that really aren't at all ready to interact with space in the early turns. In the 21 games playing this deck that I recorded the results of, I won 19, for an astounding 90% win rate. Despite the small sample size and low stakes matches, this was a far better result than even I anticipated, partially because unlike the next deck I'm going to talk about, Kylo doesn't really have any bad matchups, or at least any truly unwinnable ones. Instead, Kylo seems to operate under a very simple premise. If your opponent draws the perfect answers, the game is going to be very, very hard. But if they don't, even just once, the game is going to be very easy. This obviously means that in a higher stakes environment where you need to win more and more games in a row, this absurd performance may not hold up. I would be surprised to see Kylo win the Galactic Championship, for example, but despite the deck's lack of Plan B, it hurts, and most decks in the current meta don't seem at all ready for the oncoming train. Before I talk about the next deck, there is the question of why I'm talking about double Red Kylo and not the Kylo Yellow that seems to be increasing in popularity. This version of the deck would drop Fifth Brother for Shin Hati, Mr. Bones for Greedo, and several other cards for yellow aggro staples like Surprise Strike, Hotshot DL-44 Blaster, and Breaking In. You also get access to Aura Sing, which is a truly exceptional turn 1 play, but I consider most of these swaps to be lateral moves. Greedo is likely a little bit better than Mr. Bones, Shin Hati is probably slightly better than Fifth Brother, and Aura Sing is clearly miles better than something like Migs Mayfield. But in order to get access to these cards, you need to be willing to sacrifice Tarkin Town, and I just haven't found that to be worth it. Tarkin Town gives you a number of opportunities to essentially decide the game early, especially against the currently popular Force decks that completely run out of gas if you snipe their turn 1 play. The yellow deck also presents slightly faster, unpreventable damage, but it doesn't really seem to go quite as wide as double red, which in conjunction with your Tarkin Town activation allows you to prevent decks from establishing a stronger board presence than you without slowing down on damage to base. There are, of course, other factors like Chaos of War for 3 and the ability to sideboard more copies of Aggression, but at the end of the day, which version you go with is at least partially subjective. I just happen to like double red more. I've already made several references to the popularity of Force decks. Talzin and Han too seem to be the standout users of this mechanic so far, but Obi-Wan and Maul are also seeing a decent amount of play, with a number of other leaders filling out the fringes of this particular niche. But I'm continually surprised by how many of these Force decks lose to Kit Fisto. With just one attack, Kit has one of the most clearly defined weaknesses of any leader in the game, but with a relatively early deploy, extremely strong ping ability, and stealthily useful keyword, he's a bit stronger than most people seem to realize. The foundation of this deck bears a strong resemblance to the Han 2 green decks that have been popular in the meta recently, and I'm not making the claim that this is better than that deck, but it does get to make use of a lot of the same Force payoff cards like Ki-Adi-Mundi, Mace Windu, and Yoda, alongside some strongly statted Force units like Gungi, Obi-Wan, and Kelleran Beck. This is obviously not an unfamiliar package of cards for anybody that's played against Han 2, but Kit excels in a few key areas that make him strong against other Force decks. The first strength is his ping, which allows him to trade favorably and establish an early board presence, especially against greedy Han players that absolutely insist on using his ability to present low HP targets. The other strength is the ability to actually engage with the space arena, since the ping ability requires Jedi units, not Force units, freeing you up to use several Jedi tag ships, of which the best is Anakin's Interceptor. This ability to flood the board is further augmented by Jedi Consular and General's Blade, which allow you to play extra cards at reduced rates. This all combines to turn Kit into a much bigger deploy than his humble stat line would suggest, often deploying with 3, 4, even 5 attack. His 6 health also makes him a strong candidate for General's Blade placement, which can help you play Yoda as early as the next turn, which can box entire decks out of the game using cheap Force activations like Sorcerous Blast. In short, Kit Fisto amplifies both the strengths and weaknesses of the Force package to an extreme. When ahead, Kit Fisto's board state can feel like an impenetrable wall of stats and incremental advantages, constantly playing ahead of curve and refilling his hand while sniping anything his opponent tries to stick to the board. But like most Force decks, Kit Fisto really struggles to play from behind, especially if his turn 1 play is interrupted, making certain matchups against Tarkin Town feel borderline unwinnable. Of these matchups, the worst is probably Cad Bane, who by himself is a hard enough counter to keep Kit out of the top tier meta. But if you're playing against a lot of Force decks yourself, or if your local meta is playing a lot of decks that really struggle with lists that push the tempo, Kit Fisto is my personal vote as the most underrated leader in Legends of the Force. This leaves us with just one more deck to talk about today, and I'm reasonably sure I've saved the best for last. But I do want to acknowledge that unlike the 2 lists I just talked about that were based on existing archetypes but built by myself, this deck is almost entirely unaltered from the original list I found on Star Wars Unlimited database. The fact that this deck is also much better than the first 2 can only be a pure coincidence. But it is, in my opinion, the best deck of the 3. Though Kylo and Kit are capable of being quite punishing in the right scenarios, they don't really have a lot of gas in the tank for when things go wrong. Thrawn ECL, on the other hand, genuinely feels like it has the answer for almost everything if you play correctly. Though this deck features fewer Legends of the Force cards than the other two, the standout card here is the new Vader, a unit capable of making 2 or even 3-for-1 trades with relative ease provided it gets to ambush. With that in mind, Thrawn ECL surrounds Vader with a package designed to outvalue opponents, both using his on-defeat doubling ability, as well as just by playing generically good cards. Thrawn is capable of presenting a strong early board state with double procs of cards like Val, Cobb Vanth, and Vanguard Infantry, the last of which can be played for free alongside Krennic Turn 1, an ability also shared by Owen Lars. Owen Lars allows you to search for your Force units, but also gives you a source of healing, which is another thing Thrawn does exceptionally well with cards like Onyx Squadron Brute and CR90 Relief Runner. Once you hit the mid-game, your options become deadly, with Set 1 and Set 5 Vaders, the ever-present command fill-in staple Overwhelming Barrage, and Thrawn's flagship Chimera, all ensuring that you continue to outvalue and outtrade most opponents regardless of matchup. In that sense, Thrawn is almost the exact opposite of the two lists I mentioned before that are defined by their polarizing matchups and specialized linear rushdown strategies. Thrawn doesn't really seem to have any unwinnable matchups, nor does he really seem to have a great deal of dominant ones. Instead, as an almost toolbox-style mid-range deck, Thrawn is situated to at least be capable of winning against anything on the other side of the table. Provided, of course, that you play well. That qualifier has cost me a fair amount of games, but even with my questionable skills, Thrawn has presented himself as a standout deck that I genuinely believe could make a meta splash even beyond the fringes of viability. But together, these three decks paint a very partial picture of the expansion of the Star Wars Unlimited meta. The expanded card pool has presented new opportunities for homebrewing, as well as the reintroduction of several older archetypes. And for the first time in the game's history, it's really begun to feel like the decks clawing at the door of tournament viability are truly unlimited.